Well, you see, the word responsible, it's in the word, response. Able. You have to be able to respond. Part of what moral responsibility is.
Well, but it's the nature of the procession. If you proceed from the source that is a father, then you must be a son and an only son. It's the nature of a procession. Have you ever heard the word procession? Have you paid heed to the prefix pro in the word procession?
This is gonna be stuff like that. Like
But this is to go even further beyond. This isn't even my final song. I'm not an old man. I'm not senile. I must be hibbity bobbity boo sexuality, people. Get me the money.
show me the money. This is Officer Stevens. You can log me out. Kind of. I didn't really get much into the ontological problem. There's like an intersection of three problems. You've got the is-ought gap, the guillotine dilemma, the whatever you want to call it, which is just, what's going on that gives something the status in the universe of warranting duties. How can something be intrinsically valuable? And related to that is the anthropological problem, which has different parts to it, but you can consider it in terms of a motivational problem. Like, it's not enough for intrinsic value to just be some intrinsic value, because prima facie you could have some kind of Platonism, but then whatever you have as intrinsically valuable is in no way going to engage human motivations for the same reason. It could just be intrinsically wrong to think in terms of truth and falsity. Well, it's impossible to avoid that too. I mean, that's just an inconceivable experience. Can you imagine? It's not just that you can't imagine doing that. It's just that, like, all of our talk about and all of our thoughts about these things are in terms of truth and falsity. So to even conceive of Platonism would then be plagued by the fact that it's not a moral way to think about Platonic objects, not a moral way to think about that which is intrinsically nice. You've got to abandon reason to be moral. Yeah, so like just as there's kind of an is-ought gap, there's kind of an is-will gap, or an is motivation, or a ought motivation gap. But like, just because something is abstractly obligatory, or just because something is in some faraway abstract Platonic sense valuable, that's not going to guarantee that it has any connection to human motivations, to the ways we think and reason, to the way we have emotions. And so we may not be moral agents, or even if we are moral agents, the very nature of that which is intrinsically valuable might just doom us to be hopelessly evil. And then there's just the epistemic issue, which is just that, like, in the midst of all this, even if there were these moral truths theoretically in the universe, almost like the Force from Star Wars, it's very mysterious. It doesn't mean that you've got the right tools to find out what's good and evil. And that's why moral philosophers rely so much on the nonsense term intuition. You've got to have a moral fact that is sufficient in and of itself, that we somehow have access to, and that protects the way we think about it, and that is something that can actually be integrated into the way we feel and the way we remember things, the way we think about things, or the various ways we're motivated to make judgments about things. It can't just be like this faraway, indifferent fact that has no connection to human emotion. But you're always going to have those kinds of problems on impersonalism, because you're always going to have some kind of abstract universal or abstract particular that is the good, that is that which is intrinsically valuable. Those sorts of things don't have any explanation how we can know them. There's no explanation for why humans are motivationally anchored to them, or why they form some kind of basic category of human judgment and action. And there's no reason in those things why they connect with epistemic facts. There's no reason to think that there's a harmony between moral belief formation about those things and rational belief formation about those things. Maybe you just have to be irrational to be moral, and that's just the sad story of the universe we live in. But an easy way to see how one of the thinking about personhood is a way to think about how God, the Christian, isn't like that, because he being personal in the way that he is with us, and we being persons who image his original personality, helps explain why God fulfills those three conditions, why he doesn't run into those same objections. He's not an abstract universal, he's concrete. Unlike an abstract particular, besides being concrete, he's relevant to any scenario. He's the most universal thing there is. He's the thing that controls all other things. He creates human consciousness and psychology. So he's in a position to be perfectly relevant to all of our drives. He's the thing that would presumably have precedence over all our desires and our emotions. The kind of thing which it's easy to understand that we would be the most taken up with, or the thing that is of our most concern. He has set us up to be social creatures. So we understand him to be a father, we understand him to be a king. We can talk about him setting up covenants with us that have responsibilities and obligations, along with benefits and boons and those sorts of things. The same way that we reason about human beings. So he's very relatable, but he's very relatable as a social connector. So that makes it very easy to understand why not only is he like tied to the very nature of humanity, you know, the person who controls our motivations from the bottom up, but he's the most important interactor, the most important person who interacts with our motivations and who can be bonded to us in a way that nobody else can. It's obvious, right, that he can reveal himself. As a person, he talks with us, and he, in setting up these covenants, communicates what he wants and what he doesn't want. So this is just, the more you compare and contrast what the Christian God is like versus what is supposed to be of intrinsic moral worth in a competing system, you can see, like, well, these alternatives don't have substitutes for what God provides. God provides revelation. These other things don't. God sets up a covenant relation between man and other things, which is inherently relevant to the way he designs our brains and our minds to work. You know, the universal of the good on Plato really doesn't have any explanation as to why we should think in terms of the good or not, any more than a bee or an ant. As to God being intrinsically worthy, there might not be as much to say about that, but one thing you can say is that as a moral exemplar, and which Platonism is not going to have, for example, Speedy Watkins is not going to have a moral exemplar. There are no moral exemplars of ultimate status on these other views. That's something that Christianity. There are other religions that attempt that, right? But Christianity is kind of on its own terms as far as God himself is incarnate. So we have a perfect human example who is the image of God twice over. The image of God because he is the Son who eternally images the Father, but also the image of God because he is the proto-man. He is the original exemplar of what perfect humanity looks like. But that said, so that exemplar and the example we have in the Trinity, the archetype, sets us up for us a moral agent and a moral judge who considers himself morally worthy. The members of the Trinity are completely satisfied with each other. The Godhead. God is perfectly in love with himself. He is satisfied with himself. He's satisfied with himself, and he is perfectly satisfying to himself. So you can cash it out into finer terms like that. And this is where systematics would be really useful. But I will make this side comment that in terms of arguing different views, I don't think the way to argue about that which is intrinsically valuable is to try to tell someone they need to come up with some kind of special, ontological reduction. Like, well, there's this explanation behind why they are this way. For two reasons. One, because because we're already Christians, we know that like part of being that which is intrinsically worthy, part of being inherently praiseworthy, is being the kind of thing that isn't dependent on anything else. So it's just going to have special kinds of explanatory relations. It's going to be, because we already know that that is Yahweh, we don't want to be hypocritical and ask other people for arguments that we already know are just kind of silly. But secondly, I think another person might think of it as brute or basic, whatever, but the issue is going to just be that like the way that anyone comes across these, the way that anyone puts forward their own view about what is intrinsically valuable, because they're a sinner and they're putting forward an alternative to the truth, they're going to have epistemological resources which you can just attack and make it an epistemological problem. And it's just kind of a waste of time to make it out like there needs to be some kind of grand ontological explanation as to why this is. Well, let me put it this way. Here's a better way to put it. Like, the issue is going to be for alternative views that when they try to specify what in the universe is the thing which is intrinsically valuable, there are going to be properties which are readily apparent that are not consistent with it being intrinsically valuable. Like somebody might talk about brain states. But I mean, it's impossible to point to a brain state without pointing to a particular brain state. How do you get the universal from that? And once you have the universal, how is it not abstract? How do you relate it back to these individual brain states? What is it about them then that demarcates them from other brain states? You see, but those are just questions that are just not going to be the kind of questions you can ask to a Platonist or to a Christian or to a Muslim, because they're already playing a better game with ethics in ontological matters, or at least they can play a better game. It's ultimate. God is ultimate, and Platonic forms are supposed to be in some sense irreducible or ultimate or whatever. And to that extent, you're not going to be playing the same kind of explanatory game that somebody who says, hey, there's this thing in the universe, it's not ultimate, it's just like this certain kind of landscape in the brain that is magically the right one to have. Okay, well at that point, like when it's not ultimate, when it's farther down the line, when it's farther down the stream in explanations, now I want to check all the surrounding water and see what it explains why it's the right one to have. But that's just not the kind of explanatory question that God's open to, because he's self-explanatory. So if there's like, why do you need the Trinity? That's what you were talking about, yeah. Okay. Yeah, all right, I'm back, Bronson. Yeah, they're just okay. I mean, the easy thing to point to is, yeah, you can. First of all, there's just objections to Unitarianism on a whole, but also there are moral values without which reason suffers. Just can't make sense of certain judgments that we make. Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, you can just make objections to Unitarianism, but also there's just, in the same way that Platonism has this problem of explaining certain moral duties and values, Unitarianism suffers the same problem, right? So like on Platonism, the issue is like, what does it mean for there to be a Platonic form of justness or justice? Because it's inconceivable, it's nonsensical, it's unintelligible to talk about that sort of thing irrespective of persons being in the right moral equilibrium. Justness has to do with a certain right relation between moral parties. So if there are no moral parties, there are no equilibriums to exist. What is justness then? And the same kind of thing holds for Unitarianism, right? Like, I mean, what does it mean for God to be trustworthy when you go to look at the concept of trustworthiness and it has to do with, again, a relation between two parties, or at least that's involved in the concept. Namely, you've got one party who is worthy the reliance for something of another on that party. That just ain't gonna fly for a Unitarian God, right? Like, you can't be trustworthy because, strictly speaking, because there's no other parties in existence outside of creation. And there's this funny turnaround where, like, my ability to assess my own trustworthiness is contingent on my ability to think socially about the issue, on my ability to look at the context and say, other people could trust me. In order for me to, there's this funny turnaround where in order for me to assess my own trustworthiness, I need to be able to look at other people. I need to have a concept of myself in the context of society as a whole. I need to be able to reason about what other people would think about me and what other people should be able to think about me or should think about me. Right? If I have no context for how other people think and how to relate to other people, I just wouldn't have no idea whether I'm trustworthy. My trustworthiness is only rationally accessible in terms of thinking about other people. And so what would it be like for God to be otherwise? Right? Now somebody might want to say, well, God's just not a creature, so he doesn't have to be like that. Okay, but what we want to do is have God have some kind of explanatory power with respect to these things. So the Trinitarian has that. The Trinitarian can say, well, sure, obviously God doesn't have to think about an external society, but he can think in terms of other-centric relations. Because he's triune, because the Father has the Son and the Spirit, the Father can think about the Son and his relation to the Son in the context of Son and Spirit. But the Unitarian just has to say, God just explains it, and that's it. But how is that any different than the atheist saying, this is all at bottom just a cosmic fart, and the cosmic fart just explains it, and that's it. So it becomes arbitrary. Yeah, so I'm now giving you advice in reverse, but when you have these conversations, or when you're doing a debate or whatever it is, I think it's best to preface by saying what we're going to see is, to the extent that my opponent wants to attempt parody views and play copycat and so forth, what we're going to see is that the more Christian-like you are, the less problematic your view. And that's quite conspicuous, right? You don't want that to be the case if you've got the right worldview. If you got the right worldview, you shouldn't have to be like Christianity. You should just be able to state, here's the necessary sufficient conditions for knowledge, morality, whatever. It's this Tyler Bible or whatever, and you shouldn't have to play copycat at all. You should be able to say, here's where Christianity has been borrowing from my worldview, blah, blah, blah. But what we're going to see instead is that my opponent is going to want to move closer to me every time he can, and he's seen that there's a genuine problem. And that's conspicuous. That is its own little inductive argument that Christianity is true. Having said that, when people want to make that copycat move, I don't know, we're kind of moving away from like morality, and now we're just talking religious philosophy in general. It seems to me very problem. One big problem that those things have, Bonson, is that their quote unquote Bible is always going to be spurious. So it's like, I remember having a conversation with some guy on Clubhouse, and I'm pretty sure you put the audio on YouTube. And at one point in the conversation, I don't know if this is on YouTube, at one point in my conversation with him, he was like, well, it's just the natural light of reason that reveals knowledge to me instead of God. He wanted to pull the copycat thing. And when I pointed out, well, there's going to be this problem of like public verification that like for a Christian, you can distinguish between private subjectivist claims about revelation and the actual thing, because you've got this public document that has a historical chronology. It doesn't come out of you, it's from you, and anyone can publicly verify what you're saying. They can check what you're saying against the book. In the case of Tyler, um, even in the first place, he might not have. But supposing he's like, well, I've got this book. This guy I was talking about on Clubhouse tried to pull that, and he was like, well, yeah, I think somebody could read the Critique of Pure Reason by Kant. Blah blah. Like that's just the light of pure reason's thingy. What happened? Well, I pointed out immediately, like, well, that book's been critiqued, right? The critique of the philosophy of Kant has all kinds of objections to it, right? Just like there might be objections to the Book of Mormon, or there are objections to the way Jehovah's Witnesses handle the Bible. There's objections within the Quran. Like, you can just internally critique the Critique of Pure Reason by Kant. There's nothing special there about that book. And I expect a fellow person who's into philosophy to know that. Like, obviously, it's an old book. There's been a lot of objections to it, unless you're just a Kantian, which I know he's not, and kind of a crazy one at that. You're not going to think that this is some kind of divinely inspired by the light of reason textbook on how knowledge works. So there's a problem. So whenever Tyler goes to point to a book, supposing that he does, he's going to have this dilemma. On the one hand, if he picks something that's historically rich, like the Critique of Pure Reason or some sacred text, there's already stuff out there that's going to be objections to that. It's already known to the public. So at the very best, he's just saying, let's postpone this conversation until I go read that and throw some problems at you. But if he decides, like, oh, hey, I wrote this book down in my backyard, then the problem becomes, like, one of explaining the historical significance of religious philosophy up to this point. He's going to have to explain why the text is not private revelation. But fundamentally, that's always going to be, that's the fundamental disagreement behind any worldview. We have two different, but yeah, this is not really a moral disagreement anymore. This is just Tyler saying Tyler's either going to say, in effect, people can have ethical knowledge without Christian revelation, because people can have knowledge of that variety without revelation simply gedur. Or he's going to say people can't have the knowledge without some kind of revelation, but it just happens not to be Christian. It's like Muhammad or whatever. And the problem is going to be if he ties himself to something historical like that, and then he's just signing himself up for whatever the objections already are to that. If he's trying to propose something new, then the difficulty is going to be how he provides a historical account of that, given that he's giving new revelation, right? Because like the Bible, if somebody asks about the Bible, right, the story is going to be, well, Adam and Eve knew this God. He's been there since the beginning, and he's been doing things since the very beginning to reveal himself to humanity. It's just that this hasn't become a global scale until Jesus. That approach is new as of Jesus. But Tyler's proposing the idea that, like, what, God's been silent this entire time until yesterday when he came into my backyard and said, hey, I'm just like the Christian God, except for a few things. That's kind of spooky. Why would I take that view over this one? All right, what can we argue about one way or another that will prefer that text over the Bible? and the correlative explanations inside each. A Trinitarian. I don't. I'm not sure I understand that. I am not. I am not saying. If you're asking me this, I'm not conceding that someone can have a Trinitarianism that's not Christianity. That's not what I'm conceding. No, I'm simply saying that the issue is how you conceive of the Trinity is tied to how you acquire religious knowledge simplicatur. So now, if you're not the presumption is that when you go to make the I've got a Trinity 2 objection. The general presumption is that of natural theology, that you can just construct this as a general philosophy of religion, and you don't need a book to know this sort of thing. You don't need special revelation to know this sort of thing. So so the question is that, and if Tyler's making the move to try to copycat us as well and say, well, no, you do need special revelation, then the issue becomes, well, I don't know enough about. I either need you to tell me which of the historical examples we're working with, because we're historical creatures and there's all this religious stuff with which we've been raised. We don't just come up with stuff out of our asses. We are confined to the cultural milieu of which we're a part. And presumably God has some providential power over that by which he can make sure we come about knowing the truth. And if it's not some kind of well-known historical thing like that, but you're saying I went into my backyard and God gave it to me, then I just don't know enough about how your book conceives of the Trinity to give you an ontological objection just yet. But it would be a sufficient objection just to say that, look, part of intrinsic to your worldview is that your Trinity is not my Trinity, and intrinsic to my worldview is that my Trinity is not yours. But I can know my worldview because I got this Bible. If you can't know your Trinity, then that just means you can't know the belief that it's not mine. You haven't differentiated your God concept from mine, and that means every time you go to talk about it being not Christianity, that's just you closing your eyes and pretending it's not the Christian God every time you talk about it. Yeah, exactly, right. Like he has a rhetorical but non-substantive head start in the fact that, oh no, is that the? I wonder if it's the same kind of head. That's hilarious. He has a non-substantive head start in that everything about Christianity is already out there, from the internet to whatever else. So that's not the same thing as like Joe Rogan saying, I had this dream last night. You know what I'm saying? Like, that information ain't out there, bro, so you're just going to have to update me on what the heck it is you think is going on in the universe.
And whatever is over there seems to know you. It seems to understand. It seems to be you're communicating with something that's far more intelligent than you, far more advanced, and not hindered by all of the things that we're hindered by, like our egos and our nonsense and our insecurities and our civilization and culture. It's like it's some sort of other kind of consciousness.